All of that is behind us, and we move on to things like CS50 Finance, which is going to be the first of 2 web-based programming projects that we'll do this semester. And you'll find that the skeleton code that we give you for these problem sets is really meant to empower you for final projects to have a starting point, to realize now that what a lot of students do for final projects is they take their CS50 Finance or their problem set 8, they kind of throw out code that's irrelevant to their project, but then use the basics for their own final project. So realize we've tried to provide you not just with this framework for implementing this tool, but really web projects in general. Toward that end, know that actually, I screenshotted this as well. So this was a screenshot of a penny stock that we used last year for problem set 7. It's only 40 cents there, according to this screenshot here. And I knew about this stock because I'd gotten this email from a guy named Tim in my spam folder. We usually change this every year because this is 2010. In 2011, the A5 Labs are not doing so well. All thanks perhaps to a bit of excessive trading. But the stock is still traded, and you'll see that this is the one that's used in the problem sets examples. So dinner this week, for those of you who've not been able to make past lunches, we thought we'd do something on Wednesday at 6 p.m. If of interest, go ahead to cs50.net/TV. And then a word on seminars. So this is the most seminars we've ever offered historically. All of these will be filmed, and if you'd like to register for any of these, go to that URL there. In particular, let me draw your attention to 2 particularly novel ones involving mobile programming. So some of our friends at Microsoft are going to be offering probably tomorrow night this App Lab phone for Windows programming. More details can be found at the URL there. They've offered to present some fabulous prizes for those of you if you choose to elect to do some Windows Phone-based project. And also, too, know that we'll have a BlackBerry programming seminar in a week or so. And for this, RIM has kindly donated some BlackBerry Bold phones. So if you would like to go the route of developing for BlackBerry, drop me a note, and we can see if we can hook you up with some actual hardware for that. All right. So PHP. So PHP is fundamentally different from C in that it's not compiled, it's interpreted. And an interpreted language is something that you still write in the same way with source code, but you don't actually run it through a compiler and then run the resulting executable. Rather, you write your source code, then you run an executable, and you pass to that executable the PHP source code as its input, as its command line argument, really. So in the world of PHP, the interpreter is generally a program called php.exe, on Windows at least, or php.app on Mac, or PHP on a Linux system. So what's nice about interpreted languages is that they actually lend themselves to much faster programming. You don't have to jump through as many hoops to actually get your code working, and they tend to be much higher level in the sense that you don't need to worry henceforth about pointers and locations in memory. You don't need to worry about memory management anymore. Rather, the interpreter, in this case PHP, is going to handle a lot of that minutia. Interesting details, but tedious details as you advance further in your understanding and savvy with programming. So just to give you a sense of PHP, here is perhaps a wonderfully recommended resource that just talks about the language. Here's a loop, here's a condition, and so forth, so that rapid fire you can acclimate to the syntax. And you will find PHP syntax very similar to C, which is one of the reasons we use it at this point in the course. In terms of functions, though, one of the nice things is that we also don't need to adhere to this convention of having a main function anymore. Rather, if you want to write a program in PHP, you open up a text editor, you create a new file, and you just start writing PHP code. You don't have to have a main function per se, but you can have and will have other functions that you write or that you use. So conditions look just like this. And this is the exact same slide we showed in week 1 when we started talking about C. The general format for conditions in PHP is going to be the same. In the case of Boolean expressions, these are going to look the same, both with ORs and with ANDs. Switches are going to be the same. In fact, switches are a little more generous in PHP in that you don't need to just compare integers or chars. You can actually do string comparisons using these cases. So that's actually a little more friendly and versatile as well. Loops are actually going to look the same. You're going to have for loops. You're going to have while loops. You're going to have do while loops. And so this ultimately is to say that we're going to see a lot of familiar syntax. We also have arrays in PHP. But the nice thing about PHP's arrays is that, one, you don't have to declare their size in advance. If you want an array, you effectively just say, give me an array, and then PHP figures out what size it should be. And if you keep adding and adding and adding and adding to it, PHP will take care of resizing it for you. You don't have to worry about malloc and realloc and all of these lower level details anymore. The language is, again, much higher level. You also have have variables, but variables syntactically you'll find are a little different. For better or for worse, every variable in PHP is prefixed with a $sign. The upside of this is that it really is obvious what is a variable. The downside is that you have $signs all over the place, but this is just the convention that these folks chose. So in this snippet of sample code here, I'm declaring a variable called s. I'm setting it equal to a value of hello world. And then notice what I'm omitting. I'm not specifying the word string. I'm not specifying the word char star. In fact, when you declare variables in PHP, you're no longer going to specify the type of a variable. Rather, PHP is going to figure it out from context. And indeed, the context here is pretty obvious. The double quotes obviously suggest this is a string, so there's no need for us, the programmer, anymore to say string s or char star s. Same in the case of floats and integers and even booleans, so we relax that constraint. PHP is loosely typed, whereas C is a strongly typed language. And so this has both upsides and downs, but for now, it means that a lot of the syntax that you might have struggled with for some time will start to slip away. So loops, too, have some nice new features. It's a very common paradigm in PHP to want to iterate over an array, because PHP is very often used in web programming. Web programming often involves databases. Databases often involve lots of data. And so it makes sense that you might want to iterate over a whole bunch of data, like your list of friends or your stock portfolio, and print out the same kind of information again and again in a loop. So PHP has this very nice for each construct that C did not have. And the syntax is generally as follows. For each, and then in parentheses, you specify the name of an array that's stored in a variable. In this case, I arbitrarily called the thing array, $array. For each array as element, as is just this new keyword. $element is also arbitrarily named. But ultimately, inside these curly braces, I can now do this again and again with $element. On each iteration of the loop, PHP is going to automatically change what value is in element by taking the next element from array successively. I don't need to do plus plus. I don't need to do that sort of manual manipulation anymore. But perhaps most powerful about PHP and a lot of these higher level languages, Ruby and Python and the like, is that they support something called associative arrays, which is just a new word for what we spent the past week on, namely hash tables. Those of you with Java backgrounds might have called these things hash maps back in the day, but an associative array is simply an array whose indices no longer need to be numbers. Right? Up until now, anytime we've had an array, that you index into an array by way of bracket 0 or 1 or 2 or 3, and that's a little limiting because in problem set 6, you wanted to answer questions of the form, not where is this word, but is this word in my hash table or in my trie? And so in the case of hash tables, the input to your check function was typically the word that the user that had been pulled from the Austin Powers script, for instance. And so you wanted to say, is this word foo in the dictionary? And you wanted to use foo as your key and get back a value of true or false. Well, PHP makes this so incredibly easy that you can re-implement the entirety of problem set 6 in just a couple of minutes. And so, in fact, let's see how we might do this. I'm going to go over to my sorry, should have told you last week. So let me go over to my appliance. I opened up gedit. I created a new file called dictionary.php, and I'll go ahead and start typing this. So the one distinction with PHP that you have to remember is that you can't quite just start typing code. You actually have to tell the interpreter that you're about to start writing PHP code. And so the convention the world adopted is that if you're writing a PHP program, the top of your text file should have open bracket question mark PHP, and then at the bottom of your text file should be essentially the opposite, but without the word. So question mark angle bracket. So most web servers, though, actually allow you to shorten this to just this. There's a good amount of religious debate on the web as to which is better. Frankly, I think this is much simpler and more elegant. And so you'll see, at least in a lecture examples in the problem set, that we use what are called short tags. We don't bother writing PHP all over the place. But what these tags mean, and these are not HTML tags, these are, for better or for worse, PHP tags. This means here comes some PHP code. And so I can start implementing problem set 6 by thinking ahead as to what I need. Well, ultimately, I'm going to want, for instance, a variable. And I'll call this size. That's going to represent the size of my dictionary. I also want to have an actual dictionary. And so a dictionary, I like the approach of a hash table. Just conceptually, it's easy in that you insert a word and you want to get back true or false. So that begs an associative array. And to declare an array in PHP, one of the ways is literally call a function called array, open paren, close paren, and that gives you now an array of size 0. But recall that arrays in PHP will resize themselves, and their indices, the thing in square brackets, no longer have to be numbers. And so that allows me to do things like this. Let me now scroll down and let me start implementing something like the load function. And I'll call D the name of the file that's being loaded, so large or small, as in the case of problem set 6. And I have to do something a little annoying in PHP. I actually have to say global size and global dictionary only because when I'm inside of a function, unlike C, I need to say explicitly if I'm trying to use a global variable. With that said, global variables are not all that common. I've simply gone this route because it's nice and simple to get started here. So let me do something error checking oriented. So if it is not the case that this dictionary file, $D, exists, I'm going to go ahead and say, if not exists, I'm going to go ahead and say return false. So if D does not exist, return false. And also, just for good measure, if not is readable, D, go ahead and also return false. So you didn't focus on these lines so much in your own implementation, since we wrote a lot of the error checking code in speller.c. But these are now PHP functions that just come with the language. And they're a lot easier than some of the techniques we had to deal with in C. But believe it or not, the load function is almost done. I'm going to go ahead now and use this new construct for each, let me say, let's call this, let's do this. Words gets file of D. Turns out that file is a function that loads in a text file, and for each of its lines, puts each of those lines in a different element in an array. So at this point in the story, words is an array containing every word from the dictionary. So now what I want to do is a little something like this. For each of those words, as let's call it word. So this is the construct that's like a for loop, but it's going to do all the auto incrementation for me. So for each of those words in the array as a word, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Dictionary, word gets true. Size plus plus. Done with my load function. Right? How is this actually working? So dictionary is an associative array. An associative array is just an array whose keys no longer need to be numbers. They can be actual words. And just like an array with numbers associates key with value, number with value, an associative array can certainly associate word with value, or in this case, word with Boolean. So now I have this amazing data structure that took me one line of code to implement that I can just say $dictionary bracket word close bracket gets true. And what's that going to do for me? Well, PHP is going to figure out where in this data structure called an associative array to put that word, and it's going to store the value of true. Yes, 1, whatever the implementation may be in that data structure. And size plus plus is just like C. Now, I need to actually do one little thing just for good measure here. I should probably do this. I should probably, actually, the one little thing I do have to do, I have to say word gets chop word, in case you're playing along at home, only because the file function is not quite smart enough to get rid of the new lines at the end of each line. So if I want to get rid of those new lines, chop is one way of eliminating the white space at the end of that word. But I don't have to deal with lowercase or anything like that, because recall that the dictionaries we allowed you to assume would be lowercase. So return true. That's it for the load function. And really, the magic is in here. The rest is just error checking and syntax. So what about, how about size? Well, size was pretty easy for all of us, but let's just do that one for good measure. So function size. Now I can say global size, return size. Silly though that may seem here, but it's also certainly pretty simple. And now let's do check. Check was kind of the interesting one, because that's the one that was called again and again and again. So let me scroll up to the top of my file, do function check. This time I'm going to be checking a word. Let's arbitrarily call it W. And in here, I need access to the dictionary, so I have to deal with that little syntax. But now I can just do this. First, let me force the word to lower. So stir to lower is a function in PHP that changes a string to its lowercase form. And so now I can just do this. If in the dictionary array at location W equals true, well, return true, else return false. Or if you really want to be fancy, you can just say return that. Bam, problem set 6. So why the hell did we just implement problem set 6?